I think it really depends where you stand and where you are. Outside Russia and outside the former Soviet space, Gorbachev is part of a huge story called the Western victory in the Cold War. And at the time, it was considered to be a common victory, actually, because he was the main protagonist of this. He is the man of a whole era that started in the late 40s when Stalin ruled the Soviet Union, when Mao Zedong came to power, and he ended that story almost by miracle when no one expected it. In fact, he came to power in 85 when everyone thought this thing would last for generations and generations. And people lived in the fear of nuclear war repeatedly. So this is what he will be in most of the West and outside the West, but not in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, people remembered him as a leader who lost his country. And, a little bit counterintuitively, it is for Western viewers, it is not a story of liberation and emancipation. It's a story of economic chaos.
How did he approach the reforms that he thought were needed so badly, and how successful or unsuccessful was he in executing his plans?
Well, it's interesting. He started his reforms when no one knew how to reform the communist planned economy, and on a similar road, but nobody could guarantee that Deng Xiaoping's reform would succeed so spectacularly at the time. So Gorbachev took a very different road, the road that at the time was called socialism with a human face. And, he remained sort of like social democrat to the end. He thought that, neoliberal capitalism, private property, prices, inflation, all this would punish Russians too much. And he wanted almost to spare his people from this harsh experience of transition. But unfortunately, what he did led exactly to this result at the end, when for a generation, for a decade, millions of Russians were thrown into misery.
And what was his fate after he stepped down in 1991? How did he come to be regarded in the political sphere?
He tried to run for presidency in 1996, still relatively free elections, presidential elections at the time. Yeltsin, his nemesis, and his successor, the Russian president, was reelected then. But Gorbachev only got half a percent of Russian votes. Pretty pathetic. His wife, Raisa, was totally against it. She thought that his political career should be ended with dignity. But he was a passionate political animal. But overall, I think he was an optimistic and a kind of kind man who wanted to do something for his country. And unfortunately, most of the Russians considered him a failure and didn't vote for him. Rather than considering him a tragic figure, as some historians I know do, I would consider him a happy figure. Of course, his reforms failed. Of course, he lost his country, but he lived on, and it's a unique case in Russian history when the leader who lost his power lived more or less normally for 30 years in Moscow and could travel and lecture and see how history developed.
What regrets do you think he had looking back at the demise of the Soviet Union?
He always regretted that the Soviet Union collapsed. He was a person of mixed ethnic origins. He had Ukrainian blood in him and Russian blood in him. So the growing problems of Ukraine, I think, became one of his biggest regrets. We don't know enough about his attitude towards the current Russian-Ukrainian war, but I do suspect that this is one of his major regrets. And another one, he really wanted genuinely to take the entire Soviet Union into the West, into Europe. When people say that, his proposals, to join NATO and to integrate into Western European economy was a little bit artificial. Yes, but that was his dream, a common European home. And I think it's wrong to say he underestimated the problems that stood in the way. He knew the history of his country. He knew his people. He just was optimistic. And in this optimism, he will always stand on the opposite pole to Vladimir Putin, who is ultimately a pessimist. He gave up on this project.
Tell us a bit more. What views did he hold of Vladimir Putin and vice versa?
Well, I think Vladimir Putin was very careful to say anything about Mikhail Gorbachev, but it's easy to read, to read his lips and eye expression and all that. I think they always were in this kind of silent competition. Gorbachev was the leader of a much greater country, a true superpower, and yet Putin considered him a failure, although he never said it. And for Gorbachev, when he viewed Putin taking Russia down the road to confrontation with the world, closing the country, magnifying the number of people arrested while Gorbachev opened prisons for political prisoners, that made Gorbachev regretful that, but it wasn't his responsibility. He didn't consider Putin his responsibility. Putin was appointed by his nemesis and rival, Russian President Boris Yeltsin.
And just finally, tell us a bit more about what he was like as a person, as a family man.
He was a wonderful, wonderful family man who never mistreated Russian women. You find Russian men and women sometimes in rough kind of tumble relationship. He was almost unbelievable for a Russian, and many Russians could not understand why he always bowed to his wife and was courteous and took her for all his trips. So he introduced a totally different, more civilized, I would say, approach to women, to his family that was not part of the Soviet communist culture since Stalin times. And also, I think he was a personally very warm man. I remember my personal meeting with him in the Gorbachev Foundation in Moscow around '94. He immediately kind of put his arm around me. We sat on a sofa and said, "Professor, what is this guy Yeltsin doing down there in the Kremlin? He's destroying my legacy." But he said it with such a passion, such emotion that I thought, well, it's kind of unreal, a former leader of the Soviet Union talking to me like this. He inscribed his book for me, and I keep it, I treasure it.
Great to hear your memories. Thank you so much for sharing them with us, Professor Vladislav Zubok.
Thank you for having me.